Number 1. Uncle Owen. Uncle Owen was always a bit of a weird guy, but we loved him as kids. He lived out in the woods in a cabin he supposedly built all on his own. When we were young, we always loved going out there because it was such a different experience than living in town. It was so quiet, except for the sounds of the animals and bugs of the forest that could actually sometimes get really loud. During the day, it was fun to play outside in the woods, but at night, it could get pretty creepy too. Uncle Owen would also tell us ghost stories, and as kids, those sort of things scared the hell out of us. But no one ever minded really, it was a ton of fun. When I was 10 years old, I remember being at the cabin with several other cousins of mine. It was a regular summer day, and we had spent the day playing outside. Our families would sit and talk after dinner, and that was generally when Uncle Owen would begin telling us one of his scary stories. They always, not surprisingly, took place out in the woods, in an area similar to where he lived. They were also long and rambling stories that you could never expect to be over really soon. But we didn't care because he was such a good storyteller that everyone could just sit there and listen to him talk for a long time. This night, it was very windy outside. It had been like that throughout the entire day, but it seemed to get worse at nighttime. We could hear the wind gusts howling outside, which just gave more of a scary element to the story that he was telling. The funny thing is that, although this was the most important storytelling that I remember, I don't really remember anything of what the story was about. What I do remember is the howling of the wind and Uncle Owen stopping in the story several times, as if he was listening to something that was happening outside. The older boys were sure that he kept listening because he was trying to add some scary element to the story that he was telling, but he shushed them every time they piped up about it. He seemed to be sure that he was hearing something outside, and figured after a while that maybe his shed door was open. The wind might have been blowing the shed door open and closed, causing banging noises. So Uncle Owen said he was going to go and make sure that the door was closed. He said it would be terrible to try and fix the door if it got blown off its hinges. He told us to sit tight, and he would be right back to finish telling us the story. Well, the older boys were at it again. As soon as Uncle Owen left, they began telling us that he was just messing with us all. Uncle Owen would come back to the house and try to find a way to scare us. The only adults there were my mom and my aunt, and they knew we liked the scary stories, so they didn't do anything to try and shut the boys up. So we all waited for the inevitable scare that would come when Uncle Owen came back in and tried to frighten us. The only problem is, that moment didn't come right away. We waited and thought that Uncle Owen was just trying to ratchet up the suspense. But after waiting for quite a while and him not coming back, my mom and aunt began to get concerned. The older boys, one 15 and one 16, decided to go out and see what Uncle Owen was doing. Perhaps the door had broken and he was trying to fix it. After a while, though, the boys came back in the house, and they were no longer joking around. They told my aunt and mom that Uncle Owen wasn't out there. The shed door was opened, but not broken, so they closed and secured it. However, they looked around everywhere, expecting Owen to jump out and scare them, but he never did. There was no trace of him anywhere. My aunt went out with the boys and took Owen's shotgun with them. They were out for a while, but when they came back, they had no further news other than they couldn't find Uncle Owen. They had called for him and received no answer. They looked all around and could find no trace of him at all. I wish I could give this story a happy ending, or at the very least, a resolution. But I can't give you either of those. Uncle Owen had disappeared into the windy night when he went outside in the middle of telling a ghost story. He was never found. A body was never found. Nothing was ever found. Uncle Owen did have some enemies out there, and some people think he was killed by them for owing them money or something like that. I don't remember all the rumors. All I remember is missing him and never finding out what happened that windy night. Number 2. Exploring. I grew up in a very poor, rural family. Even though we lived out in the country, there was one thing that I always remember my family telling me. If you see anything weird when you're out in the country, it's best just to avoid it. There are some really weird and dangerous people out there, and it's best to leave them to themselves. I didn't give it much thought when I was younger. My dream back then was to be an FBI agent, and if there was trouble, I always felt like law enforcement could handle anything. I guess maybe I just didn't think there might be some things that they didn't want to put their noses in. But this isn't about law enforcement or anything. It's just about a scary experience a friend and I had when we were out exploring. We were teenagers at the time, about 16 years old. My friend Joey actually saw our explorations out into the woods as hunting. He would always take his rifle with him when we went exploring. He almost never shot at anything, though. I just think he was one of those guys who just really liked his gun and liked having it with him when he was out in the woods. Once he had a car, we began taking much farther trips out into the country. There was never any traffic on those old hill roads, so we would just park by the side of the road and just go out and explore without worrying about the car. So we would find new places to go and check out, and many of these took us pretty far from home. We were driving pretty way out because we were pretty curious to see something completely new. Joey was talking about hunting squirrels, but I had never seen him take a shot at a squirrel, so I didn't expect that he was serious. We didn't know the area that we were at. In fact, the dirt road just ended. There was a gate at the end of the road, but we didn't know the purpose of it. There wasn't a fence around to keep you out of the woods, but the gate clearly showed the end of the road. We decided to park there and get out and look around. If you have ever lived out in some of these areas, you will understand what sort of area we were in. There hadn't been houses around for a while, although we did pass several driveways that led to places that we couldn't see from the road. These would have been to the really rural people who probably did hunt to get all their food. As usual, we didn't know what we were looking for. We were just looking. Joey had his rifle with him, of course, but we always hoped we would find something interesting. In the past, we had come across waterfalls, creeks, old buildings, and things like that. But I guess deep down, I always hoped to find something historical. Perhaps like an Indian burial ground, or maybe something like left over from an old war. But I hadn't come across anything like that before. The area that we were in was pretty damn cool. It was pretty thick with tree and brush, and we had to be careful where we were walking. There were many thorny bushes, and it really sucked when you got a vine or something stuck to your pants, and you had to pull it off of you. Joey kept telling me that he was hearing some strange noises off in the distance. He thought it sounded like some sort of engine running or something. I really didn't hear it, but I could hear something. I told him it might have been someone living down the hill or something, but since I couldn't make out the sounds really well, it must have been someone far away. There were other noises that both of us could hear. It was mostly animals, and I kept wondering if Joey was gonna shoot at anything that day. It really looked like there were no traces of human life in that area, with how thick the brush was in places. That got my hopes up that I was going to come across something different, something new. I really wasn't sure how long we had been out there, without coming across anything interesting. That was when I guessed Joey was getting bored with what we were doing, and he took a few shots toward where he said some squirrels were. Again, for anyone worried about it, Joey never really shot anything, and I believe he probably would have freaked out if he killed anything. So there didn't seem to be any harm in what he was doing. However, not long after he made those shots, I noticed something out in the woods. It wasn't off in the direction of where he had been shooting, though. At first, I thought I was just hearing some sounds, but then I noticed some movement, and I thought that I saw someone moving around in the woods. Joey wasn't far from me, so I called over to him. I mentioned that I thought I saw someone in the trees, and for him to come and take a look. It would have been weird to come across anyone that far out in the woods, so I was naturally a little worried. When Joey came over, he noticed some movement too. He was mildly worried also, but he was trying to act macho with his gun. He kept holding it in a weird defensive posture, telling me not to worry if there was anyone out there. And that's when I heard the sound of some sort of motor trying to start. But it didn't fully start. I asked Joey what he thought it might be, and he wasn't sure. Then we saw the figure emerge from the trees. It was a pretty big man who looked like the hillbilly from hell, possibly. I wouldn't know how else to put it since I'm not the best at describing things, but he looked like someone who probably hadn't had a shower, nor even shaved in his entire life. He was walking pretty slowly in our direction, and he had a very obvious limp as well. But he looked pretty scary as hell as he was coming towards us, limping on his left side and dragging something on the ground with his right hand. "You been shooting on my property?" he yelled at us. "You been shooting on my land?" Joey just stood there and dropped his hand that was holding the rifle. It fell to his side, and he just stood there watching. It was then that we noticed what the man was holding in his hand. We also knew what noise we had been hearing that day. The man had a chainsaw. "You don't be shooting on my land," he yelled at us as he tried to start the chainsaw. It took him a few tries, but he finally got it done and it roared into life. Joey looked too shocked to move. I grabbed him by the arm and told him that we should run. Some reading this may think that I should have told him to shoot at the guy, but like I mentioned, Joey had never even tried to shoot at animals. He wasn't going to try to shoot at a person. I finally got him to turn and run off with me. Now, we were fortunate that the guy hadn't been that close to us before we started running. Plus, he had the limp, and he was carrying a chainsaw, which would have made it hard to run. But the whole thing was still scary, and he had started limping, rushing in our direction. It was hard running through the woods. We got caught by thorns and burrs and all sorts of other things, but it didn't matter much while it was happening, because of what we had seen after us. We just wanted to get back to the car. It was a horrible run, and we were both bleeding by the time we got to the car. And then it was a real bitch to get it to turn around. And when we did get the car turned, I looked to the side and I saw the man out in the woods. He wasn't terribly far from us. But fortunately, we were in the car and we drove off, scared half to death. We told my parents the story. It was pretty weird how they really weren't surprised. They told me that it was a hermit who didn't want someone hunting on his property. He might have been cutting firewood when he heard the gunshots go off, but they weren't surprised he chased us with a chainsaw. People out there do some weird stuff, and it's best to leave them alone, they told us. Number 3. The Well. This is the weirdest thing to ever happen to me, but I swear that it is true, and for the life of me, I have never been able to explain it. My grandma and grandpa lived in a holler way out in the country. Whenever I would visit, I would love to just go hiking and see what I could see. One day, when I was a teenager, I was there, and I had been out hiking for quite a while. There was a river that I normally follow so that I wouldn't get lost. On this day, I strayed away from the river when I found an old abandoned dock in the middle of nowhere. It was falling apart and looked like it hadn't been used in ages. It made me start to wonder if maybe there were some old campgrounds in the area. So I started away from the river, looking to see what I could find. I eventually came across what looked like an abandoned summer camp. Although there weren't any standing buildings, I did find a few foundations that had survived. I wasn't sure how old the place had been, but it must have been abandoned for a really long time. It was truly the coolest thing that I had ever found when I was out. When I was walking around the camp, I noticed an old well set off from the camp. I'd always been a bit scared of wells. The thought of falling down in one had always been a terror that I have no idea how it developed. But teenagers are often fascinated by things that also scare them, so I thought I would go check it out. The well wasn't covered at all, and I peered down into it. I thought it might be cool to call down into it and hear my voice echo back, so I tried that, and I got a pretty good echo back. However, it was what happened after that echo that frightened me. I heard another boy's voice answer back to me from inside the well. The voice called out for help. To make sure I wasn't hearing things, I called back into the well. Immediately I heard the boy's voice calling for help in the well. He wouldn't say anything else, but he sounded desperate, and I figured he must have been if he had fallen down the well. I didn't know what to do. I tried to find some rope or something, but I was unable to find anything that I could lower down into the well. All I could think of was to try and hurry back to my grandparents' house and try to get help that way. I made it back, but I didn't get any real help from them. They insisted that I probably imagined the whole thing. Back then, and even nowadays, I hate when people say that. It is so condescending. I know what my imagination is capable of, and it's not capable of imagining a whole camp with a boy stuck down in a well. But I still couldn't get them to help at all. When I took the phone myself and called the police, they didn't take me seriously either. They said that there were no abandoned camps or wells in that area, plus there were no reports of any children missing. They didn't think it was my imagination, though. They simply thought that I was pulling a prank on them. I was really worried, and figured I'd have to help the kid on my own. Hey, at least I'd be a hero then, right? So I took some rope and went back out to the river to find the dock, so I could get to the camp and rescue the boy. Only trouble was, I was never able to find the dock, no matter how much I searched for it. I thought that I could find the camp without it, though, and I searched for the camp. I could have sworn that I knew exactly where everything was, but I couldn't find the camp or the well. They were nowhere to be seen. I had to eventually give up on the whole thing and head back to my grandparents' house. I have never been able to explain it. In the following years, I often hiked around that area, confident that I would find the dock or the camp or the well, but I never came across any of them. Also, I was never able to find any information about the camp or the well, and there were no missing children reported during that time period. I really have no idea what I experienced that day, but I remember it all very clearly, and I know for a fact it was not my imagination. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. First, I would like to thank my paid Patreon members, beginning with my 2 VIP members, Chiamerah Cat and Pixie Hopper 8. I would also like to thank Heidi H and Chronic J. If you want to join my Patreon, you can always join as a free member too, and the link is in the description. I hope I didn't cause any controversy when I was discussing the possibility of making a video about my uncle who was murdered. If I actually do this, and I'm not 100% decided, I will take the time to do it right, and for it to be a voice for the victim. That is what matters, and I definitely won't exploit the tragedy. I mean, I hate when people make horror movies with real-life serial killers to scare people, so that will not be what I'm doing. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please hit the subscribe button and the bell below. That way you'll be notified of all new content. Leave me a comment to let me know what you think of the video. I try to get back to most comments if I can, and consider sharing it with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. I would also like to thank all of my free Patreon members, including Alien Unicorn 13, Catherine Lynch, Alabama Guy 334, Michael Vasquez, Bonnie Lynn, Collet Bond, Krista Pike, Prince UVA, HF Creations, Bonnie Gibbs, Linda Moore, DJ Lira, and Evil Black Cat. And whether you're a Patreon member or not, please don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.